It's the Bird Emergency. I'm Grant Williams. I'm your host. I've got no particular expertise in the ornithology world, but it's my pleasure to bring to you, as often as I possibly can, somebody who has some ornithological expertise and to feature some of the birds that are hanging on by the skin of their teeth. Today, I'm speaking to Ryan Carter, who is at Edith Cowan University in Western Australia, and Ryan's project is on the Abrolhos Painted Button-quail. Now, Ryan's being supervised too by a past guest of the show, so we're all friends. We're all friends. Hello, Ryan. How are you?
Hey, Grant. Yep, good, thank you. Looking forward to having a chat about buttonquail.
Now, look, just before we get into the buttonquail, I can't help but notice that you've got an accent there, and I don't know if you saw the discourse on Twitter earlier today about postgrad doctoral students from Australia not taking up the opportunities, but that international students are taking up all the opportunities. Now, tell me, with that accent, are you now an Aussie or are you still a Pommy?
Well, so yeah, I was born in the UK and I've lived here since 2005. So I've got my Aussie citizenship, but yeah, so technically a domestic student. So, but no, yeah, from the UK originally, but yeah, I've lived here most of my life. So
cool. All right, we're going to talk mostly about your project on the Abrolhos Painted Button-quail. Now, let's work a few things out. How are buttonquail not quail?
Yeah, so if you looked at one, the first thing you'd probably jump to is a kind of quail, but they are different. The other name for buttonquails is hemipodes, which, if you're a bit familiar with your Greek, is half-foot, and this is because buttonquail lack the hind toe, which true quail have, and they also lack crop. So these two things are what really distinguish them from the quail. They're in their own family as well, which includes all the buttonquails and a quail plover, a species found in Africa. Used to include the plains wanderer. So I know you had your guest Dan was working on the plains wanderer, and he would have touched on the buttonquail and how they used to be together, but they've since been split. But yeah, so they're actually as well in the wader and shorebirds order, which has been quite interesting. They're not originally what they were put in as the rail order. So yeah, they're pretty interesting little bird and kind of an offshoot of their own, if that makes sense.
So not having a crop, does that tell me as a layman that their diet is going to be more towards live food than relying on seeds and grains?
Well, no, actually they're predominantly granivores, which is quite interesting. With when they're younger, they have a large proportion is invertebrates, but yeah, they're predominantly granivores.
Wow, that's pretty interesting. Now, the painted buttonquail is widespread over a lot of Australia and it's not common, but it's not rare and it's certainly not threatened. How different is the Abrolhos variety of the painted buttonquail? Are we looking at a race or an isolated population or a distinct subspecies?
So like you mentioned, they are widespread across mostly south of Australia, so southwest, southeast, and Tassie, and of course this Abrolhos population. The Abrolhos populations are smaller, which you would expect with islands. It's a common phenomenon with islands that species can evolve to be a bit smaller. They're also a bit less colourful. They're a bit more drab compared to the mainland subspecies. And yeah, so it's really the plumage and the size which is the basis on the split. We are hoping to do some genetic work in the future to really clarify that relationship. There's doubts as to whether they should be split but the genetics hasn't been done. So yeah, watch this space.
Is there any visible difference apart from the size? Are there any slight variations in plumage?
Yeah, so like I said, the plumage is a bit less colourful. The mainland is a bit brighter, but yeah, otherwise pretty much the same plumage. The females have a real reddy buff shoulder, but yeah, much the same, to be honest.
I don't know whether you've looked this far down the track, to extend your work, but what would the genomic work cost you to do?
So, yeah, that's a good point, and that's probably the main reason that I can't really do it for my project. But we're hoping to take some blood and hopefully use that for future genetic stuff. It might be a case of we can do it on campus here, or whether we have to outsource that to another company. Yeah, but we haven't properly looked into that yet.
Okay, well, let's talk about the Abrolhos, because a lot of people won't know what we're talking about, particularly those from overseas. Tell us what the Abrolhos are, so when we keep talking about it, they know.
Yeah, sure. So the Abrolhos is an archipelago, and it's about 60 k's off of the west coast of Australia. So about midway up the WA coast, if you head directly west, you'll hit the Abrolhos. They're thought to be separated for about 6,000 to 7,000 years from the mainland. So there's quite a shallow, well, in relative terms, a shallow ocean between the mainland and the islands. But they're a limestone group. So the main kind of substrate is sandy and limestone, form of coral reefs, I guess. And that's basically what they are. They're interesting in that they're influenced by the Lewin Current, which runs down the west coast and brings warm water down from the north. So this makes them quite interesting in that they're the southernmost coral reef in Australia in terms of latitude. So that's quite interesting. So you get a lot of tropical fish coming down and temperate fish coming up to the Abrolhos to breed with coral reefs. So it's a really interesting kind of system.
And the Abrolhos Painted Button-quail is a resident. It's not, as far as ever visiting the mainland, but is it moving around between the islands of the Abrolhos?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and that's one of the aims of my project. So they originally were found on 3 of the islands: North Island, East Wallaby Island, and West Wallaby Island. They're now lost from North Island, and I can touch on that a bit later, but the 2 remaining populations are on East and West Wallaby, and they're quite close together, the islands. So one of my aims for my project is to look at whether they are moving between those 2 islands. It's never been proven. The islands are about 1.5 k's separated, so they definitely could, but we don't know whether they're actually breeding on both islands or whether there's a bit of a meta-population system going on where they're breeding on one and visiting the other, but we just don't know that for sure.
And what other birds are resident on the archipelago?
So they're a very important shorebird nesting group of islands. Millions of birds each year nest on the Abrolhos. So that's an important aspect of the islands. And we also have other bush birds. So the brush bronze-winged pigeon is another important resident. Silver eyes, scrub wrens.
I'm imagining you've got some honey eaters out there.
No.
They're
I think from memory there's maybe chats, but I can't quite remember, but no obvious honey eaters on there. It's pretty low scrub, not a whole lot of flowers on there. So the other main group is you get a lot of raptors, so ospreys and white-bellied seagulls. They're very prominent on the islands. From just walking around, I was seeing them so much, and that was pretty outstanding, actually.
Okay, you mentioned that the Abrolhos, the group of islands, are about 60 k's offshore. Okay, how do you go about doing your work out there? Tell us about how you've designed your project and what are the practical things you're doing.
Yeah, so that's obviously been one of the biggest challenges with this project is that it's not, you can't just drive to your site and set up. That's the main logistical challenge, is organising transport and making sure there's a good line of communication between the mainland and the islands when you're out there. We've been pretty lucky, actually, that the project is in collaboration with Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions, so that's been really handy. They've just recently got a boat that they are using to travel between the islands and Geraldton, so we're working quite closely with them. They're providing transport to the islands and ferrying us between the islands to do the work, so that's been really good. So yeah, I'm actually very lucky in that respect that they're willing to help me out and provide that kind of support, which wouldn't be possible without them, I don't think.
How are you surveying. Or tell me what's the design of your project? What are you looking to ascertain, and how are you going to do it?
Sure. So they're a very cryptic bird. So traditionally when we do bird surveying or monitoring, we do point counts. So we go out in the bush, you listen to calls, you see the birds, and that can give you the data you need. With the buttonquail, they're very cryptic. They have really no tendency to fly unless they're flushed. So they're predominantly running around in the scrub, and they're most active kind of early morning, dawn, dusk. So that presents another challenge with bird surveys. So what we're looking to do is use camera traps. And I'm sure Rob would have mentioned in his episode that camera traps are really useful for ground-dwelling, cryptic, shy birds. They're really useful for picking up behavior and real presence, absence data that you couldn't probably get by just going out in the scrub. So camera traps are our main tool that we're going to be using for the project. And the main aims are to really understand why we're picking them up in certain areas of the islands. What habitat are they using? Why are they selecting, for example, the coastal scrub over the limestone platform? What are the main reasons that are driving them to certain habitats on the island? So that's never been looked at for the painted buttonquail, but particularly for the Abrolhos subspecies. So that's the real piece of information that we want to find out.
How much time can you put into being actually on the islands?
So the islands aren't that big. They're a couple of k's across, so they're not huge, but they're harder to walk across than you might think. So to put the cameras out, we're looking to put about 100 cameras out across the 3 islands. So looking at about 10 days for each trip. So yeah, a decent amount of time. But obviously with being on an island, there's no facilities on there. We need to be very self-sufficient with power, with water, with food. So that's a real challenge. But as I said, we're lucky that they have the boat that we can, if we needed to, we could go back to the mainland. But yeah, it's definitely not a thing you can go out for months on end and just spend your whole life there. It's pretty remote.
Has the department at Edith Cowan Uni invested in those camera traps?
No, so they're about $1,000 a pop, so they're not cheap. But again, one of my supervisors is one of the research scientists with DBCA, and she's used camera traps a lot for her work, and she's kindly offered them to me for my project. So that's, again, I've been very lucky that's been offered to me. Otherwise, it would be, we'd be looking at thousands and thousands of dollars of equipment.
Well, if you were going to put out 100 traps, I would imagine that you would pick 100 survey points and then use different cameras over maybe 3 or 4 weeks so that you didn't need to invest. And that's $100,000 worth of cameras if you were to do them simultaneously.
Yeah, so that's meant that for my project, I can put all the cameras out all at once and leave them and get some really important data on where are the birds, what are the main habitat types they're using, and really get a sense of hotspots and why are they choosing a particular habitat, but why are they not choosing another habitat, why they're avoiding, say, the limestone as opposed to the coastal scrub, and that the cameras will be really useful in determining that.
Now, again, I'm really interested in the methodology of how you do things, and you keep saying we. So how many of you are involved in this project?
Yeah, so of course I'm doing a lot of the logistic and organising and most of the field work, but having 100 cameras to put out is not easy. So DBCA have luckily offered to help me. They've got some field techs that can give me a hand, and also hopefully some volunteers that I can bring up with me and that can really assist with that. And I should mention as well, the other aim is to, like I said, look at whether they're moving between the islands. So to do that, we're going to be colour banding the birds on the 2 islands, and hopefully with the cameras picking up whether they are moving between the islands. So that's another challenge, and Rob's an A-class bander, so he's hopefully going to be doing all the banding. So yeah, it's a pretty neat little project, and I'm really lucky to have it, to be honest. How
long is it scheduled to run for, Ryan?
So we have 2 years for the Masters. For the past kind of 8 months, I've been doing the proposal and pre-candidature stuff, the risk assessment and the ethics and all that. And hopefully in the next couple of weeks, that'll all be approved and I can start planning my field work and getting all the equipment prepped and really nailing down what we're going to be doing. So yeah, I'm hoping to get a few trips in before mid next year. That's when my end date is for the project.
Now, I love going into the nuts and bolts of how these things work, because so that the wider population, if they hear it, can get an idea of how you've got to tie it all together. Now, because you're working with the university, but also in conjunction for your project with a government department, who's covering the insurance risks for you?
So do you mean in terms of health or?
Well, in terms of you, if something happens to you, you're scrambling across the limestone platforms or something, and you hurt yourself badly and you need to be airlifted off the island, that's going to cost many thousands of dollars. Are you indemnified by the uni, or because you're working in collaboration with the government? These are the practical things that you need to consider when you're doing field work, because bad stuff happens.
It does.
Not that I'm wishing it upon you at all, Ryan. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah, I was going to say thanks for that. But no, to be honest, I haven't really looked into that. One of the things that you have to do in order to get your candidature is to do a risk plan. The risk
assessment. That's what made me think about it, because when you're working remotely, it's all sorts of things can happen. I'm guessing there's even snakes out there, aren't there?
Well, there's nothing venomous, luckily. There are carpet pythons on one of the islands, but they tend to stick to the limestone and kind of do their own thing. There's really no risk in terms of being bitten by snakes, or
it's just accident.
It's trip, slips and falls really. And probably the other main thing would be heat, exhaustion and dehydration, but they're things that you have to keep on top of. I've done enough field work to know my limits and when I need to take a break, it's being mindful and using a bit of common sense is the real important thing. But
I'm sure you're very careful. Yeah. It just sprung to mind when you talked about the risk assessment. I haven't mentioned it with anybody else, but because generally I guess it's covered by the university, but I just wondered and it's the Abrolhos. Is it a state reserve? So there's no federal park or anything there.
Yeah, so really interesting as well. So it was only a couple of years ago that it was made a national park. So I think that was a big move, especially in terms of conservation and kind of preserving the islands, is that being a national park, there's a lot heavier presence of government and that there's more incentive for them to look after it. As I said, it's an important seabird nesting. There's coral reefs. There's a ton of ecosystem services that it provides that are really important. And so I think that was a good move. And the state government's invested a lot of money in preserving it. So there's talk of infrastructure that's going to be built on the islands for tourism. And that's a real driver for my project. There was this national recovery plan that was made for the bird. And part of that was to really understand how we can best protect this bird for future developments. What areas are really key to the bird that we really cannot develop and that we need to protect. So yeah, that was a real driver for my project, is how are we going to protect the islands as best we can to prevent future decline of the bird, because there was a study done a couple of years ago and this particular subspecies was, I think, 5th most likely to go extinct in Australia. So I think it was like a 70% chance of extinction. So it's really on the decline, and something needs to be done about it.
Okay, let's talk about the threats to the Abrolhos Painted Button-quail. We've got carpet pythons there, so I'm guessing that if they came across eggs or nestlings, they would be gobbling them up.
Sure.
But what are the main predation risks for the bird, and is there an invasive species predator problem?
There's always an invasive species, and this bird's different. So I mentioned North Island, which the birds are now thought to be extinct from, and North Island's very interesting in that it's had a lot of problems that have impacted on the bird. There's a few that potentially have worked together to finish it off on the island. There's quite a big fisherman population on the island. Most of them are seasonal, but there are a few that live there permanently, and that's been over a number of years. And so that brings a lot of problems potentially with rodents and hunting. So just an overview. So on the island, there were no rodents before. There were no carpet pythons. and there were no Tamar wallabies. And since human settlement on the island, Tamar wallabies have been introduced. House mouse has been introduced, and these are probably the main reasons why the bird has gone extinct. So from a predation perspective, the house mouse would certainly take eggs if they were there. They'd compete for seeds with the bird, and they also have potentially changed the habitat, and that's probably the main reason why the birds have gone extinct and are in decline on the other islands, is this habitat loss. So I mentioned Tamar wallabies, and they're another real threat to the bird. They've dramatically changed the vegetation on North Island and degraded it, and this is probably the main reason why, along with the mouse, that the birds are now extinct. Interestingly, on the remaining 2 islands with the populations, there are wallabies on there, but they don't seem to have changed the vegetation like they have on the other island. So that's another aspect of my project that I wanted to look into, was how has habitat change really impacted on the bird? And house mouse isn't present on the other 2 islands that we know of as well. So that's a real kind of point that I would like to get across, is to look into how much have house mouse really impacted on the bird, and how do we manage house mouse so that it doesn't make an incursion onto the other 2 islands.
Is there a management plan currently in place for the islands, or will your work inform the development of a management plan by the department?
Yeah, so hopefully my work can do that, or at least inform the risks, the real risks of the introduction of house mouse and further habitat damage to the bird. I don't think there's a management plan currently. There's, like I said, there's a recovery plan for the bird, but I'm not sure on an actual management plan for the islands in general.
We see it time and time again, Ryan, that it would be much easier to stop the problem animals arriving in the first place than perhaps in the future having to go through the cost of eradicating them. You said there's a community of fishermen living on the island. On one of the islands. Is that area must be excised out of the national park? Is it that the whole of the archipelago isn't national park?
The whole archipelago is. So, yeah, that's all included. So that's, of course, I think I haven't looked into it completely, but I imagine that would have raised some eyebrows, and there would have been probably a bit of backlash on that national park being created. But I think on the whole, it's a good thing. And I know from other people that have worked up there that a lot of the fishermen have really encouraged to help conservation, and a lot of them do care a lot about the islands, and they do want to protect them. So I think you had Claire Greenwell on.
Certainly did. About the fairy turn.
Yeah, so I've had a few chats with her about the islands and what challenges she faced, and she said that the fishermen were really quite helpful and instrumental to her project, and offered to put her up while she's staying over there. And so, yeah, that's another important part of conservation, is getting the locals on side and keeping them involved. And so I think, yeah, anecdotal data is another thing that I might potentially go down and use the knowledge that's already on the island from the fishermen and, yeah, incorporate that somehow.
Definitely. You don't want to be spending time reinventing the wheel if you don't know.
No, that's it.
That Claire did mention to me before she took her trip out to the Abrolhos that she was going. And I think Tegan, another of our guests, was out there too. So it's great that so many people are interested, because obviously the pressure from outside in the birding community in general will continue to ensure the preservation of the Abrolhos. Now, are there any other species that are hanging out there regularly, either the seabirds or any of the bush birds, for want of a better term, that are also endangered or threatened?
Not that I'm aware of. On a couple of the islands, there's like the sooty terns and the bridal terns. So they're obviously of significance. On the islands that I'm looking at, there's nothing else of concern. There are bush rats on one of the islands. So they're a population that's also on decline on the island. So that's quite curious as well. Whether I can look into that for my project, I'm not too sure. But it's a very strange system. There's lots of things at play that could be impacting, but we don't know. There's a lot of room to explore the actual ecosystem and what's driving it. Is there a big input from the marine environment that's changing the habitat, and how does seabird populations impact on habitat, and how does that impact on house mouse numbers, and how does that impact on the buttonquail? So that's what I want to look into, is how do these threats and aspects of the islands, how do they interact, and how does some impacts maybe enhance the impact of another? And so to really understand the impacts on their own, but how are they interacting? And so that's a real problem that I need to solve for mine.
On offshore islands, water is always in very short supply. Is there permanent water in any of the places that you're monitoring, or the birds and other wildlife dependent on pooling water, like temporary ponds and puddles, things, or is there a permanent source of water for them to avail themselves?
So this was a problem that I was tossing up whether it would be good to look into. So obviously, being a granivore, water is very important, and seeds really don't contain that much water. But I thought into it, and being dawn and dusk birds, that potentially dew and moisture from the air and condensation is an important source of water for the birds. There are salt lakes on the island, a couple of them, but as I say, probably not ideal for buttonquail. Invertebrates is another source of water for the birds. But that's a real challenge, and I guess from rain on the limestone you might get some pools forming, but as I say, that I'm sure they have ways of finding water. It's not really been well documented, so it's potentially something to look into in the future as well.
Hopefully climate change doesn't make water even harder to come by on the islands. What's the population estimate? Is there one?
Unfortunately there's not. So I mentioned they're on 2 islands. On East Wallaby, we've done some pilot study on there, and we've put cameras out. And we definitely got some detections that they're definitely on the island, and there's definitely hotspots where they're more common than others. West Wallaby is the other island, and it's a lot bigger, and that's thought to be the stronghold. That's thought to be where they're at their highest abundance. But we haven't done any camera work on there. That's the main target for me for my project, is looking at West Wallaby, looking at the biggest island where they're supposedly at their most abundant, and hopefully working out some kind of relative abundance from the camera traps if we can. But as I say, no real population estimate is really available.
Are you willing to take a stab at it? Do you think it's in the hundreds, or is it in the tens?
On one of our trips, we walked around the whole island. Me and Rob, we walked around, probably maybe not the whole island, but a good chunk of the island, and we flushed maybe 5 the whole day. The other thing with the buttonquail is, like the plains wanderer, I'm sure, you have to be very close to them. You have to be essentially stepping on them before they move, before they flush. So it's really difficult to get an estimate, to get a count of them, because you have to be right on top of them before they move. So it's hard to say. On the cameras, we picked up a lot more than we would have just walking around. So I'd say in the hundreds would be my guess. But I could be massively overestimating. I could be massively underestimating. I don't know.
Now, having recently spoken to Danny Texiera, I can't not ask you about vocalizations and whether the bird's calling, it gives you a clue of how many are there. Do you hear them? Because they do have a distinctive...
They do. I have heard them. Before. They don't tend to call, for the sake of it. I know in breeding season they call a lot more, and there's a student working on one of the buttonquail species over east, and he's used playback as a tool to get them into the mist nets to catch them. So that's it's an important thing to know, but whether you could use it for a survey, I'm not too sure. But definitely if we hear one, we'll definitely note it down. But they don't tend to call a whole lot.
Now, I know we can't really talk definitively about somebody else's work happening on the other side of the country, but do you think that playback is initiating a territorial response, or is that maybe a breeding response that they're curious to come out, or are they coming out looking for action?
So from what I have read, that they are quite territorial. They definitely have a bit of whether it's a home range or whether it's a bit of a territorial thing, I'm not too sure, but from what I've read, they definitely do have a territorial kind of instinct to respond to playback.
Have you considered using playback? I know there's sort of ethical issues with that, isn't it? Like annoying the bejesus out of them. And that can be very stressful if they are fragile in their emotional.
It can be, yeah, definitely. But again, this is a kind of thing that you have to play with the project, is these birds are so cryptic and so shy that you might set a net out, but then then they have no tendency to move around for the sake of it. So you might catch nothing. So potentially playback is the only way to get them into the nets, and that was something that I had to think about, and that's why I spoke to the guy over East, is to see how he was catching them, and he said that playback was really a really useful tool to getting them into the nets, and maybe he wouldn't catch as many by not doing that. So
well, give him a shout out. Who's doing the work over on this side of the country?
Patrick Webster, I think. He's looking at the black-breasted button-quail in Queensland, which I think, from what I know, is very endangered as well.
Certainly. Well, good on you, Patrick. Fill us in on how you're going. If you listen to this, we'd be really interested to hear how you're going, and then maybe having a look at how both of your studies come out. Obviously, very different habitats.
The other thing I thought I'd mention as well, I think Dan mentioned with the plains wanderer, is button-quail are quite interesting in that they have this kind of role reversal in their mating, and it's called polyandry. And basically, like the male is responsible for incubating and rearing the young, and the female goes off and mates with multiple partners, and that's another really interesting aspect to button-quail, and it's very rare in the bird world, so I just thought I'd mention that, and it's a bit of a quirk for them.
And of course the emu does that too.
Of course the emu.
So our big dorky bush chook. So when are you planning to be out on the island again, Ryan?
So, as I said, I'm just finishing up all of the kind of candidature, admin-y kind of thing, and hoping to get my first trip in early June, and that's to deploy all the cameras and hopefully ban the birds, and that'll give us a good solid few months of data that we can pull apart and investigate, and hopefully pick up some interesting footage from the cameras.
Yeah. For people who have never engaged in fieldwork or writing up a project such as yours, when you've collected all the data, how much time are you allocating to actually analysing it and getting everything down on paper and then submitting it?
So this is a thing that a lot of postgrads have told me, is give yourself a lot of time for the data analysis. And so I'm quite wary of that, and I'd like to get on top of it as soon as I can. But the interesting thing with camera traps is you have no idea what you're going to get on them. You might get absolutely nothing, or you might get a whole ton of things. And certainly what I've found in the past, I've done quite a bit of camera trapping, is if you forget to remove a flower in front of the camera, you may end up with 50,000 images that you have to flick through. That's a good thing, I guess, going into my project, is that I can make sure that I am really making the most of my images and capturing as much important stuff as I can, rather than Daisy.
And when you're talking about a flower, I'm imagining that in the breeze it's swaying, or it could be a branch, so it's evading.
Especially on the Abrolhos, where it's quite windy. I've had a look through some of my camera traps and had 60,000 images, and you have to look through them, but 90% of it is
a piece of grass or a branch.
So might get some volunteers for that, I guess.
Well, that was going to be my next question. Do you rope in some help to analyse the images? Because, as you say, you've got to look at every one of them. And, well, if you've got... Well, we were hoping for 100 camera traps, weren't we? By 50,000, that's a lot of man-hours.
Yeah. So I'm hoping... My hope for volunteers is that I can use them to help me with actually deploying the cameras, as well as hopefully looking through the data. I guess the downside to that is data quality, and one of the important things about data quality is ensuring that it's consistent. And so I would like to do as much of it as I can by myself, but like I said, I don't know how much data I'm going to have from these cameras. And from my past cameras out there, the wallabies were the biggest hits on the cameras. They really seem to love the cameras, and
movie stars, they love the attention.
I had probably the coolest thing I got was a younger wallaby, and the next picture was a sea eagle absolutely nailing this wallaby. So that was pretty cool. So you can definitely get some really cool info from the camera traps. So it's a pretty neat tool.
So you've got an image of taking a Tamar wallaby?
I did. And I was pretty shocked, to be honest. I was flicking through another wallaby, and I was
feel free to share that. Wouldn't that be a ripper on that? So a full grown Tamar or a young one?
It looked like a younger one. It was an adult sea eagle, but very cool.
Yeah. Well, they're big birds. We all think about how big the wedge-tailed eagle is, but
they're just as big. They're magnificent, really, especially when you're walking around on the islands and you see the shadow coming past you and you look up and it's incredible. And they're very prevalent on the islands, and a lot of my camera traps were showing juvenile seagulls coming up to the camera going, what the hell is this? Pushing it over. They're very cool birds.
And are they breeding on the islands?
They sure are. I spoke to someone that went out there and they reckon there was probably, I think, somewhere between 5 to 10 breeding pairs on one of the islands. So yeah, a lot. Ospreys are also, like I said, very common on the islands, and some of the nests that you walk past are huge. One of our carnabes.
Yeah. So we've been talking black cockatoos recently. So there we go. Tell us about the carnabes since they've just made an appearance.
Sure. So I've been very lucky over the past few years to be quite involved with the carnabes in the southwest, and definitely one of my favourite birds. And they're endangered with probably habitat loss as the main one. And I'm sure Tegan would have spoken to you about the impacts of pines and
the great cocky count.
The great cocky count, yep. And we were speaking before, but we're very lucky on campus to have birds breeding on the artificial hollows that we have on campus, and they're a real hit on the campus, really. But yeah, very cool birds.
And that all ties in, because, of course, we've spoken to Tegan a couple of times on the show, and Mick Callan from Habitat Australia has been doing a lot of work on nesting boxes, and you can listen to his episode and all the issues that comes along with providing nesting boxes. So all these issues are always intertwining, and we have to make value judgments all the time with all of these conservation decisions. Anything else you want to tell us about the Abrolhos Painted Button-quail? Have I forgotten to? Actually, what I do want to know is, do they actually make a nest, or is it just a depression height underneath a tussock, or how do they do that?
Yeah, so they definitely make a shallow depression in the sand, and they sometimes line this with twigs and leaves, and it's generally underneath a shrub, and so that's how they nest. And interestingly as well, when they forage, they scratch a little plate into the ground like a divot, and this is one of the ways that we can identify if they're there, is to go, okay, there's a fresh foraging platelet, so they're definitely present. And hopefully I'm hoping to incorporate some kind of density measure of the platelets in my sampling to see if that kind of correlates with where we're picking them up on the cameras. And so that's another kind of interesting aspect of the birds.
Now, we didn't really talk earlier on at the outset of how big the birds are. Are they as big as your fist?
A bit bigger than your fist, and I think they're anywhere between kind of 60 to 100 grams, so they're definitely not big, but I'd say like a dove kind of size, but they're not very big at all.
Of course.
With identifying them, because when they flush, they hop up, they fly, and then they drop into another shrub, and you don't get a real good look at them. But
are there other true quail on the island?
No, there's actually no brown quail or anything, just the painted button-quail.
Okay. So when they flush, you're not really going to confuse them with much else?
No. Obviously, the brush bronze-wing are quite common. Most of the time, that's what you'd be flushing. They're a bit bigger, so
they are definitely... I would think a lot bigger, unless the island variety aren't as big as the mainland variety, but the brush bronze-wing sort of bantam size. So
they're the only real other kind of granivore on the island.
Okay, well, so you've got a good 18 months still to get the project done. I hope you'll speak to us when it is done and give us an idea of what you found out, whether it was good news or bad news. But you know what happens now? We have to place you on the spectrum. So let's start with the easy question. When you're out there doing your field work, what's your field guide of choice?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, obviously, being a bit younger, I've grown up with technology and really embraced the apps that we have available, and I take my phone out with me whenever I go out, have my bird app. I use Pigeon Night most of the time, and especially with birds, and a lot of the time you don't even see what you're searching for, you hear it. So having the calls that are quite close to hand is really useful. But I would say Pigeon Night is my kind of go-to. I have a couple of other books that I use. But generally in the field, I take my.
Terrific. Now, Claire Hawkins from the Where Wedgie project and the Bookend Trust would probably give me a slap if I don't start asking this question, particularly since it is coming up to Where Wedgie time again. Are you using iNaturalist when you're out there, just recording interesting things you see?
I'm not. I take pictures I use my camera a lot as well. I take pictures of anything I see or anything I can, and even the old camera behind the binoculars, if I need to, try and get a picture and hopefully something useful comes out of it. But yeah, I have a notebook as well that I scribble notes down on. But yeah.
So I think this is going to be a difficult question for you, Ryan, because usually people are very clear about what their favourite piece of kit is when they're heading out. But you're using your phone for the app, and good luck getting some reception wherever you're going. But so you're taking a camera, you're taking your binoculars, you've got your phone. What's your favourite piece of kit? If I told you could only bring one on the next magical field trip, what would you put in the backpack?
Well, I think the more field work I've done, I used to go out with my camera and my binoculars, and got a bit annoying, so I dropped the camera and just kept the binoculars. But I would have to admit, my phone I use a lot in the field. It's got a compass, it's got a camera, it's got bird app on it, it's got a torch. I'm really curious to see what's next with phones, but yeah, I would say my phone actually. So it's not very classic.
No. Well, let me see how well prepared you are. Have you got one or two battery packs to recharge your phone?
I've got two.
Very good. Same as me. Very good.
Yeah.
Very good.
Notoriously bad for battery life. So
yeah, especially as they age. So yeah.
No, I take two.
Good. Very good. I'm impressed with that because I'm always amazed at how many people have only got one of these little tiny ones. And that's right. That's right. Now we'll have to talk about your favourite bird, right?
Oh, it's like choosing between you.
I know. It's like choosing a favourite member of your family. I know, but we've got to go there.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I mentioned I've done quite a bit of black cocky work, and they're probably the bird that's got me into birding really seriously. I've been able to be involved with banding nestlings and monitoring them quite heavily in some of their big breeding populations. So that's been probably my favourite work that I've done with birds. But I also love my raptors. Just fascinate me really, especially like your sea eagles and your wedgies and falcons. And I love my raptors really. But I guess I'd have to say the painted button-quail. But I haven't really seen them all that much, to be honest. It's been on camera traps and a quick flush. I'd say probably my cockies or the raptors, I would say.
Now, because you mentioned the raptors, I'm going to go a bit off script for a minute because I've been dealing with this issue. I can't decide what the answer is because I've got a pair of brown goshawks that are visiting the park near my place frequently.
Lovely birds.
Are they nasty?
When you say nasty, do you mean to you or to other birds?
No. Do you think they're sitting there having a look around, watching the little birds going about their business, and they're thinking, I'm going to tear that one to pieces? Because when I've seen them kill, they look different than when a wedgie grabs a rabbit or something. They look like they are very malevolent.
It's something to do with that bright yellow eye, isn't it? Yeah. It's pretty mean looking, and that kind of, they've almost got that kind of frowned look on them, like they're just ready to go for it. So I'd probably say they're pretty nasty.
Yeah, I saw one watching a group of lorikeets, and I'm amazed they didn't see it. It was just sitting there, silhouette up against a branch, and about two trees away, there's a group of lorikeets all preening each other and just relaxing after a big day feeding. Late afternoon. Wow. Just came through. Didn't take the end one, took the one right in the middle, scattered them, and took it back to the branch where it was roosting and didn't bother eating much of it. Just pulled it apart and left it on the ground.
Yeah. Well, they can take some of the rainbow lorikeets here if they want.
Yeah. I'm sure that. All right. Bucket list. The bucket list bird.
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I'd have to probably stay on the cocky and the raptor kind of theme. Always wanted to see a palm cockatoo, far north Queensland. They're just awesome birds. And probably one of the harpy eagles or maybe the Philippine eagle, something like that. Something really rare, something awesome, something that's so rare to see. But I imagine when you do see it, it's just yeah, really good feeling. So I'd probably
think-
go palm cocky or Philippine eagle, something like that.
Well, after we've all been vaccinated and we're able to travel again, I've got a trip to the Philippines down, and I've spoken to somebody who knows where there's a resident pair of the Philippines eagle on Mindanao. Super difficult place to get to. But when I'm about to book my tickets, Ryan, I'll see whether you've got some spare time and you might want to come. Yeah. Who knows? It might be 2023 before we can even think about it. Who knows?
Yeah, it's hopefully not too far away, but hopefully not too soon that we get stranded in the Philippines.
Well, we're not going things beyond our control, Ryan. We're not even going to waste any energy worrying about it. Now, you mentioned that the palm cockatoo could be your bucket list bird. Does that mean that Far North Queensland, FNQ, is your bucket list birding location, or is there somewhere else that's the burning desire to get out and have a look?
Well, so as well as birds, I love my reptiles. Huge, a bit of a herp as well. Yeah. So always wanted to see the Boyd's Forest Dragon up in Far North Queensland, which if you haven't seen, look it up. It's just so cool. So Far North Queensland is a bit of a birding and reptile kind of heaven, so I'd definitely say Far North Queensland, or probably Africa as well. That's definitely on the bucket list for me.
Okay, so you mentioned that you weren't really big into birding when you were a kid or anything, so you weren't infected as a youngster, but now two things. Are you maintaining a list? Will you go and get in the car to chase down the rare bird alert?
Yeah, you mean where am I on the spectrum? That's
exactly.
Yeah, so a bit of both, I'd say. I've done some consulting, and so bird listing is the job. So I do make lists if I go somewhere, especially somewhere new, but I don't go out to make a list.
You can't tell me what your life number is.
No, probably not. No, I don't know really. I'd say over 100, but I wouldn't take a stab. Yeah. But yeah, I enjoy just going out and watching and observing behavior, and sometimes going out for particular things. If someone said, I've seen this over there, then maybe I'll go out and have a look. But no, I'm not as bad as some of the other Brits. If an ibis has shown up in Spain, they'll get the next flight over there. Not that bad, but
I can't resist having a bit of a dig at your British ancestry. So, do you have an anorak, Ryan?
Well, I do, but I don't wear it all that often. Not in the Pilbara, anyway.
And look, an extra question, just because you mentioned that you're a bit of a herpetologist, amateur herpetologist, and you like collecting marking off your lizards and your snakes. Do you like to go out when you're bird watching or herping for pleasure? Do you like to go alone or take some friends with?
Say a bit of both, really. When I do go out on my own, I'm always keeping an eye out for things and trying to catch it if I can and get it in the hand. But yeah, I have a few friends that are into their plants and a few friends that are into their birds and stuff. So we go out and have a look around for different things and share the knowledge, and that's good fun. Yeah. I love helping people and showing them how cool some of the stuff that we have is, and especially in WA, we're really blessed with some amazing wildlife here. So it's something that I'm getting into more, and seeing how the two relate and why are certain birds not present, and how does the flora change the kind of community of birds and reptiles, and so that's something that I'm definitely getting better at for sure.
So do you see a long-term career for yourself in academia or more in practical conservation?
Oh, that's a good question.
I know. We don't back away from the issue.
No, I've always said with academia, I'm going to see how the master's goes first and whether it kills me as to whether I do a PhD or not. I've loved consulting as well. It's been a real crash course for learning everything and getting up to speed with birds and reptiles and plants and different land systems. So that's been really cool. But that's a lot of fly in, fly out work, and that takes its toll definitely after a while. But I love what I do, and definitely hoping to. I like being outside. That's the kind of bottom line, and so anything that gets me out, I'll take.
Well, Ryan, I think we've I think we've extracted everything we can from you for this episode.
Sure.
Thanks for joining me. Been a pleasure to meet you. I wish you all the success as you're out there. The Abrolhos. Look, I don't know if it's in the top 5 on my bucket list, but I think that anybody who would like to go there needs to go there quickly, I think.
Yeah, it's not just going there, but I'd encourage people to look up the Batavia and the wreck, and look up some of the history. It's really fascinating, and the mutiny and all that kind of pre-European settlement, and that's really fascinating. And there's definitely things that you can see on the islands that tell the story, and it's a really fascinating place. And encourage anyone to get out there if they can.
Well, you've just opened the door. That's a very gruesome chapter of Australia's settlement history. But yeah, if you don't mind a bit of a gory story and a shipwreck story, that's a really great one to chase up. Yeah. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks for having me on. It's been a pleasure to chat to you about everything. And hopefully some good stuff comes out and I can update you later on.
Well, I won't be the only person following your work with interest, and make sure you give us a heads up when you've got some results and come back and share them with us. I would like to hear about all of the joys and the pitfalls of collecting data in a remote location.
Sure, no problem at all.
It's been the Bird Emergency. I'm Grant Williams. He's Ryan Carter. Thanks for listening.